Robert Chen never expected that coming home early would change everything he thought he knew about his life. After 20 years of building his technology company from a small startup in his garage to a billion-dollar empire, he'd gotten used to long trips, late nights, and the constant pressure of keeping everything running smoothly. His latest business trip to Singapore was supposed to last 3 weeks, but the deal closed faster than anyone expected. For once, things had gone exactly according to plan. Standing in the Singapore airport at midnight, exhausted but satisfied, Robert made a split-second decision. Instead of staying for the scheduled follow-up meetings, he'd let his team handle them. He wanted to go home. He missed his family, and for the first time in months, he actually had the chance to surprise them. The flight back felt longer than usual, maybe because he kept imagining the look on his wife's face when he walked through the door, or how excited his 8-year-old son would be to see him. Robert spent most of the flight catching up on emails and reviewing reports, but his mind kept drifting to home. He hadn't seen his son in almost a month this time. The video calls helped, but they weren't the same as being there in person. When the plane finally touched down in Connecticut, it was early Tuesday morning. Robert's driver picked him up and they made the familiar 40-minute drive to the estate. The sun was climbing higher in the sky, bright and warm for late September. As they turned onto the tree-lined private road leading to his property, Robert felt something he hadn't felt in a long time. Relief, maybe, or something close to it. The house came into view, a sprawling colonial-style mansion that his wife had insisted they buy 5 years ago. It was beautiful, he supposed, though he'd never felt particularly attached to it. It was just a house. A very expensive house that made the right impression on clients and business partners. As the car rolled up the circular driveway, Robert noticed something odd. His son's red bicycle was lying on its side on the front lawn, one wheel still spinning slowly in the breeze. That was strange. His son was usually careful about putting his things away, especially after his mother had scolded him about it enough times. And more importantly, it was Tuesday. His son should be at school right now. A small knot of worry formed in Robert's stomach. He thanked his driver, grabbed his briefcase, and headed to the front door. He pulled out his keys, moving quietly, not quite sure why he felt the need to be silent in his own home. Maybe he still wanted the surprise to work. Maybe something else was making him cautious. The house was quiet when he stepped inside. The marble floors of the foyer gleamed in the sunlight streaming through the tall windows. Everything looked perfect, as it always did. His wife ran the household with the precision of a military operation. Not a cushion out of place, not a speck of dust anywhere. But then he heard it. His son's voice coming from somewhere deeper in the house. Not upset or scared, but laughing. Actually laughing. The kind of genuine, unself-conscious sound that Robert realized he hadn't heard from his son in a very long time. Relief washed over him. Whatever was going on, at least his son was okay. Robert set down his briefcase and followed the sound. It was coming from the kitchen, which surprised him. The kitchen was usually the domain of their cook, or occasionally his wife when she was planning menus for dinner parties. As he got closer, he heard another voice. A woman's voice, gentle and patient, with a warmth to it that made him pause. He recognized the voice. It belonged to Helen Morrison, the woman they'd hired 6 months ago to help run the household. His wife had interviewed dozens of candidates before settling on Helen, though Robert had barely been involved in the process. He'd met Helen perhaps 3 times in the past 6 months, always briefly, always in passing. She seemed nice enough, quiet, competent, professional. Robert moved quietly down the hallway toward the kitchen, and when he reached the doorway, he stopped. The scene in front of him was so unexpected, so completely different from what he'd imagined that for a moment he just stood there, trying to make sense of it. His son, Daniel, was sitting at the large kitchen island, still in his pajamas at noon on a school day. That alone would have been alarming under normal circumstances. But what really caught Robert's attention was the look on his son's face. Daniel was smiling, really smiling, in a way that made him look younger and happier than Robert remembered seeing him in months. Helen sat beside Daniel on one of the high stools, leaning slightly toward him, pointing at something in an open textbook. She was explaining something about math, her voice patient and encouraging. There were papers spread out across the marble countertop, pencils, an eraser, and what looked like snacks on a small plate between them. See, you're doing it exactly right, Helen was saying. Don't second-guess yourself. You know this. You're really good at this. Daniel worked through the problem, his pencil moving slowly across the paper. His tongue stuck out slightly in concentration, something Robert remembered him doing when he was younger. When Daniel finished and looked up at Helen, waiting for confirmation, she studied his work and then broke into a warm smile. Perfect. I knew you could do it. You're so much smarter than you give yourself credit for, you know that? Daniel ducked his head, but Robert could see the pleased flush on his son's cheeks, the way his shoulders relaxed. His son leaned slightly toward Helen, comfortable in a way that made Robert's chest tighten with something he couldn't quite name. Can we do another one? Daniel asked, and there was an eagerness in his voice that Robert didn't recognize. Of course, Helen said. But first, drink some of that juice. You barely touched your breakfast. It was such a simple exchange, so casual and natural, but something about it hit Robert hard. He stood in the doorway, invisible to them both, watching his son interact with this woman he barely knew, and realized he was seeing something he'd been missing. Connection. Trust. The kind of easy comfort that should exist between a parent and child but somehow didn't. Not in his house, not anymore. Robert cleared his throat. Both Helen and Daniel jumped, their heads whipping toward the doorway. Daniel's face cycled through several expressions in quick succession. First shock, his eyes going wide, then something that looked like fear, his body going tense, and finally something else, something that looked almost like resignation, as if he'd been caught doing something wrong and was already preparing for the consequences. Helen stood up immediately, her professional composure snapping into place so quickly that Robert wondered if she'd been practicing for this moment. But even as she straightened her spine and smoothed her hands over her simple navy cardigan, Robert could see the worry in her eyes. "Mr. Chen," she said, her voice steady but quiet. "I didn't know you were coming back today." "That was the idea," Robert said, stepping into the kitchen. His voice came out colder than he'd intended, the automatic business tone he used when he needed to be in control. "I wanted to surprise my family." He looked at his son, who was staring down at the math book as if it might offer him an escape route. "Daniel," Robert said, and his son flinched slightly at the sound of his name. That flinch hit Robert like a physical blow, but he kept his expression neutral. "Why aren't you at school?" Silence. Daniel's hands gripped the edge of the counter, his knuckles white. He opened his mouth, closed it again, and looked at Helen with an expression that Robert couldn't quite read. Pleading, maybe, or asking for permission. Helen's hand moved just slightly, coming to rest on Daniel's shoulder. It was a small gesture, barely noticeable, but Robert saw it for what it was. Protection, support, comfort. "Mr. Chen," Helen said, and now her voice was different. Still respectful, still professional, but there was something firm underneath it. Something that surprised him. "Your son has been struggling. He's been getting sick every morning before school. Stomach aches, headaches, sometimes both. Mrs. Chen has been sending him anyway, but today when I saw how distressed he was, I made the decision to keep him home. I take full responsibility for that choice." Robert stared at her. His wife had been sending their sick son to school. And more than that, why was this the first he was hearing about Daniel being sick? He'd talked to his wife on the phone just 2 days ago. She'd mentioned nothing about this. "How long has this been going on?" Robert asked, his voice quieter now. Helen glanced at Daniel, and Robert saw his son give a tiny shake of his head. But Helen looked back at Robert, and he saw her make a decision in real time. "Several weeks," she said, "maybe longer. I only became aware of it about 3 weeks ago." Robert moved further into the kitchen, and he noticed Daniel tense up even more. His own son was afraid of him. Or not afraid, maybe, but definitely not comfortable. When had that happened? Robert tried to think back to the last time he and Daniel had really talked, really spent time together, and realized with a sinking feeling that he couldn't remember. He pulled out one of the stools and sat down, deliberately putting himself at Daniel's level rather than towering over him. "Daniel," he said, trying to make his voice softer, less businesslike. "Look at me, please." Slowly, reluctantly, Daniel raised his head. His eyes were red-rimmed, and Robert realized with a jolt that his son had been crying recently, probably this morning. Daniel shook his head quickly. "Does your stomach hurt?" "Your head?" Another head shake. "Then what's going on? Why don't you want to go to school?" Daniel's lip trembled and he looked at Helen again. She gave his shoulder a gentle squeeze and Robert saw her lean down slightly, bringing her face closer to Daniel's. "It's okay," she said softly. "Your dad is here now. You can tell him." But Daniel just shook his head again, more firmly this time, and looked back down at the math book. Robert felt frustration rising in his chest. He'd flown halfway around the world, he was exhausted, and his son wouldn't even talk to him. But underneath the frustration was something else, something that felt uncomfortably like guilt. He looked at Helen, who was watching him with those calm, steady eyes. "Can you tell me what's going on?" he asked her. Helen hesitated, clearly torn between speaking for Daniel and respecting his privacy. Finally, she said, "I think there are some things you need to know, Mr. Chen. Some things that have been happening. But I think it would be better if Daniel tells you himself, when he's ready. What I can tell you is that your son is not sick in the way you might think, but he is struggling and he needs help." The words hung in the air between them. Robert looked at his son, really looked at him, and started noticing things he should have seen before. The dark circles under Daniel's eyes. The way his clothes seemed a little looser than they should be. The tension in his small shoulders, as if he was carrying something too heavy for an 8-year-old to bear. "Okay," Robert said finally. He didn't know what else to say. He felt completely out of his depth, and the worst part was knowing that he'd been so absent, so focused on work and deals and building the company, that this situation had developed right under his nose without him noticing. He looked at Helen again, at this woman he barely knew, and felt a strange mixture of gratitude and shame. Gratitude because clearly she'd been there for his son in a way that no one else had. Shame because it shouldn't have been her job. It should have been his. The silence in the kitchen stretched on, uncomfortable and heavy. Robert sat there on the stool looking at his son, who wouldn't meet his eyes, and at Helen, who stood protectively beside Daniel like a guard, watching over something precious. The whole situation felt surreal. He'd expected to come home to an empty house, maybe surprise his wife later, have dinner with his family. Instead, he'd walked into something that made him feel like a stranger in his own home. "Daniel," Robert tried again, keeping his voice as gentle as he could manage. "I'm not angry. I just want to understand what's happening. Can you help me understand?" Daniel's hands were still gripping the edge of the counter. His knuckles were white from the pressure. Robert could see his son's chest rising and falling quickly, like he was trying to control his breathing. It reminded Robert of the breathing exercises Daniel's pediatrician had taught him years ago when he used to get anxious about doctor visits. Helen must have noticed it too, because she gently moved her hand from Daniel's shoulder to his back, making small, soothing circles. The gesture was so natural, so practiced, that Robert realized this wasn't the first time she'd helped calm his son down. How many times had Daniel needed this kind of comfort? And where had Robert been during all of those times? "Sweetheart," Helen said softly to Daniel, "remember what we talked about? About how keeping things inside makes them heavier, and how sharing them even when it's scary can help?" Daniel nodded slightly but still didn't speak. "Your dad came all the way home early because he cares about you," Helen continued. "He wants to help, but he can't help if he doesn't know what's wrong." Robert felt a flash of gratitude toward Helen. She was doing what he should have been able to do himself, bridging the gap between him and his own son. When had that gap gotten so wide? He tried to think back. Daniel used to run to him when he came home from work, used to chatter excitedly about his day. But that had been years ago, back when Daniel was 4 or 5. Somewhere along the way, the conversations had gotten shorter, the greetings more polite and distant. Robert had told himself it was just Daniel growing up, becoming more independent. Now he wondered if he'd been lying to himself. "Daniel," Robert said, and this time he did something he rarely did. He reached out and put his hand on his son's arm. Daniel tensed at first but didn't pull away. "Whatever it is, we can figure it out together. I promise I'm not going to be mad at you." Daniel finally looked up at him, and Robert saw tears gathering in his son's eyes. "You promise?" Daniel's voice was so small, so uncertain. "I promise." Daniel took a shaky breath, then another. Helen gave him an encouraging nod, and Robert saw Daniel draw strength from that simple gesture. "I don't like school," Daniel said finally, his voice barely above a whisper. "I hate it there." Robert felt his stomach drop. The academy they'd chosen for Daniel was one of the most prestigious private schools in the state. Getting Daniel admitted had required substantial donations and pulling several strings. His wife had been so proud when Daniel got accepted. They'd thrown a celebration dinner. All their friends' children went to schools like that. It was expected. Why? Robert asked. What's happening at school? Daniel's face crumpled and suddenly he was crying. Really crying. The kind of deep sobs that shook his whole small body. Robert instinctively reached for his son, pulling him close, and Daniel buried his face in Robert's shirt. Through the crying, Daniel tried to talk, his words coming out in broken fragments. The kids, they make fun of me. They say I talk weird, because I stutter sometimes, and I can't make them stop. Robert's heart felt like it was being squeezed. Daniel had a slight stutter that came and went, something the speech therapist said was common in children and would likely resolve on its own. Robert had never thought much about it, but apparently the other children had. They won't let me play with them at recess, Daniel continued through his tears. They say I'm too slow and stupid. And there's this one boy, Kevin, he pushes me sometimes. Yesterday he shoved me into the lockers and I hit my head and it really hurt, but I didn't tell anyone because... Daniel stopped, his breathing ragged. Because why? Robert asked gently, though part of him already knew the answer and dreaded hearing it. Because Mom says I need to be tougher, Daniel said, his voice muffled against Robert's shirt. She says crying is for babies and I need to stand up for myself and stop being so sensitive. She says if I keep complaining the other kids will never respect me, so I stopped telling her, but it got worse. Kevin started taking my lunch, and the other boys laugh when he does it, and I try to ignore it like Mom said, but it doesn't make it stop. It just keeps happening. Robert held his son tighter, feeling a rage building inside him that he hadn't felt in years. Not at Daniel. Never at Daniel. But at the situation, at the children who were tormenting his son, and yes, at his wife for dismissing their child's suffering as weakness. He looked up at Helen, who was watching them with sad eyes. There was no judgment in her expression, just a deep sadness and concern. You knew about this? Robert asked her. Helen nodded slowly. Not all of it. I discovered Daniel was struggling about 3 weeks ago. I found him one afternoon hiding in the garden shed crying. It took a while before he trusted me enough to tell me what was happening. 3 weeks, Robert repeated, the words tasting bitter. This has been going on for 3 weeks and I didn't know. It's been going on longer than that, Helen said quietly. Daniel told me it started at the beginning of the school year. That's almost 2 months now. 2 months. Robert had been on 4 different business trips in that time. He'd been in London, Tokyo, Dubai, and most recently Singapore. He'd been closing deals, expanding the company, building his empire. Meanwhile, his 8-year-old son had been suffering, and he'd been completely oblivious. Daniel had pulled back slightly and was wiping his eyes with his sleeve. Robert grabbed a tissue from the box on the counter and handed it to him. Why didn't you tell me? Robert asked. When we talked on video calls, you always said everything was fine. Daniel looked down. You were busy. You always seemed tired when we talked, and Mom said I shouldn't bother you with little things because you have important work to do. Little things. His son being bullied and physically hurt at school was being categorized as little things. Robert felt sick. Daniel, look at me, Robert said firmly but gently. When Daniel met his eyes, Robert continued. Nothing, and I mean nothing, is more important than you. Not my work, not my meetings, not any business deal in the world. If something is hurting you, that is not a little thing. That is the most important thing. Do you understand? Daniel nodded, but Robert could see the doubt in his eyes. And whose fault was that? How many times had Robert cut their video calls short because of a meeting? How many times had he promised to be home for something important and then canceled at the last minute? He'd thought he was providing for his family, securing their future. But he'd been so focused on the distant future that he'd completely missed what was happening right now, in the present, to his own son. What did you do? Robert asked Helen. After you found out? Helen glanced at Daniel as if asking permission. When Daniel nodded slightly, she continued. I started documenting everything, taking photos of any bruises or marks, writing down what Daniel told me about incidents at school, with dates and times. I researched the school's anti-bullying policies. I called the school counselor and asked general questions about how they handle bullying reports without mentioning Daniel specifically at first. And, Robert prompted, and I discovered that no reports have been filed about Daniel being bullied, Helen said carefully, which means the school doesn't officially know it's happening. The counselor said they take such matters very seriously. but they can only act on what's reported. Robert felt his jaw clench. Someone should have reported it. I tried to talk to Mrs. Chen about it, Helen said, and Robert heard the hesitation in her voice. About a week and a half ago. I showed her the documentation, explained what Daniel had told me. I suggested that together we should contact the school and set up a meeting. What did she say? Helen looked uncomfortable now, clearly not wanting to speak against his wife in front of Daniel. But Robert needed to know. She said I was overstepping my boundaries. That Daniel needed to learn to handle his own problems and I was coddling him by getting involved. She told me to focus on my job and leave parenting decisions to the parents. Robert felt his anger spike again, but he forced himself to stay calm. Getting angry now wouldn't help Daniel. He took a deep breath. You mentioned documentation, Robert said. Do you still have it? Helen nodded. Everything is organized in a folder, photos, written accounts, a timeline. I also started helping Daniel with his schoolwork during lunch because his grades were dropping. Not because he couldn't do the work, but because the anxiety about school was making it hard for him to focus. Robert looked at his son. Is that what you were doing just now? The math? Daniel nodded. Miss Helen is helping me catch up. She's really good at explaining things, better than my teacher. My teacher gets impatient when I don't understand something right away. Something else to add to the growing list of problems. Robert ran his hand through his hair, feeling overwhelmed. How had everything gotten so broken? Without him noticing? Can I see the documentation? Robert asked Helen. Of course, I keep it in my room. Should I get it now? Robert looked at Daniel, who had stopped crying but looked exhausted, the kind of exhaustion that came from carrying too much weight for too long. In a little bit, Robert said. First, I think Daniel and I need to talk more. Just the two of us, if that's okay. He looked at his son. Is that okay with you? Daniel hesitated, then glanced at Helen. She gave him an encouraging smile. I'll be right in the next room if you need me, she said to Daniel. I'm going to start preparing lunch. Maybe some of that soup you like? Daniel managed a small smile. The chicken one. The chicken one, Helen confirmed. She squeezed Daniel's shoulder once more, gave Robert a look that seemed to say please be gentle with him, and then left the kitchen. Robert could hear her moving around in the pantry just off the kitchen, close enough to be there if needed, but far enough to give them privacy. Robert and Daniel sat in silence for a moment. Robert didn't quite know where to start. He'd negotiated billion-dollar deals, given presentations to rooms full of investors, managed hundreds of employees, but sitting here with his 8-year-old son trying to figure out how to fix the mess they were in, he felt completely lost. I'm sorry, Robert said finally. Daniel looked up, surprised. For what? For not being here. For not knowing what was happening. For making you feel like you couldn't tell me important things because I was too busy. Robert's voice caught slightly. You're my son. You should be able to tell me anything. And I should have been paying attention enough to notice when something was wrong. Daniel's eyes filled with tears again. It's not your fault, Dad. You have important work. You're more important, Robert said firmly. You will always be more important, and I'm going to prove that to you starting right now. We're going to fix this, Daniel. All of it. But I need you to help me understand everything that's been happening. Can you do that? Daniel took a deep breath and then, slowly at first and then faster, the words came pouring out. He told Robert about the daily torments at school, how Kevin had started by calling him names, then escalated to stealing his lunch, then to physical pushing and shoving. How the other boys followed Kevin's lead because Kevin's father was on the school board, and everyone wanted to be friends with him. How Daniel had tried to tell his homeroom teacher once, but the teacher had simply separated them for the day and nothing else happened. How going to school each morning made Daniel feel sick to his stomach with dread. He told Robert about how his mother would get frustrated with him at breakfast, calling him dramatic when he said he didn't feel well, how she'd given him lectures about the importance of being strong and not letting people walk over him, how she'd compared him to other children, saying they didn't have these problems because they knew how to stand up for themselves. She said, crying is weak. Daniel said quietly, So I stopped crying where she could see. But sometimes I couldn't help it. That's when I started hiding in the garden shed. It was quiet there. And then one day Miss Helen found me. And she helped you, Robert said. Daniel nodded. She didn't tell me to stop crying or call me weak. She just sat with me until I felt better. Then she asked me what was wrong, and I told her everything. She said it wasn't my fault, what was happening. She said the kids at school were being cruel, and that wasn't okay. She made me feel like maybe I wasn't the problem. Robert felt his throat tighten. This woman who they employed to manage their household had shown his son more compassion and understanding in a few weeks than he or his wife had in months. She's right, Robert said. You're not the problem, Daniel. What those kids are doing is wrong. What's happening at that school is wrong, and the way your mother and I handled this or didn't handle it, that's wrong too. Daniel looked at him with those sad, tired eyes. What are we going to do? Robert thought about his schedule for the next few weeks. The meetings lined up, the calls scheduled, the plans made. Then he thought about his son's face, the fear and exhaustion and pain written all over it. First, Robert said, pulling Daniel close again, you're not going back to that school. Not tomorrow, not until we figure out a better solution, maybe not at all. Really? Daniel's voice was small but hopeful. Really? Second, we're going to talk to some people who can help. Maybe a counselor, maybe a different school, I don't know yet. But we're going to figure it out together. And third, I'm going to be here. I'm canceling my next trips. I'm rearranging my schedule. Because you need me here, and that's where I'm going to be. Daniel hugged him tightly, and Robert felt his son's small body relax for the first time since he'd walked into the kitchen. They sat there for a long moment just holding each other, and Robert made a silent promise to himself and to his son. Things were going to change. They had to. After Daniel had calmed down and gone to wash his face, Robert asked Helen to bring him the documentation she'd compiled. What she handed him was a thick folder, meticulously organized with tabs and labeled sections. As Robert opened it and began reading through the contents, he felt his stomach turn. The first section contained photographs. Daniel's arm with fingerprint-shaped bruises. A scraped knee from being pushed on the playground. A red mark on his shoulder from being shoved into a locker. Each photo was dated and time-stamped, with a brief note describing what Daniel had told Helen about the incident. The care and thoroughness Helen had put into this documentation was remarkable, but what struck Robert most was that these injuries had happened to his son, and he'd had no idea. The next section contained written accounts, organized chronologically. Helen had documented conversations with Daniel, writing down his exact words when he described incidents at school. The entries painted a disturbing picture of systematic bullying that had escalated over weeks. It had started with name-calling and exclusion, then progressed to theft of Daniel's belongings and lunch, and finally to physical intimidation and violence. There were also notes from Helen's research into the school's policies, printouts of their anti-bullying statements and procedures. She'd highlighted sections that outlined how parents should report concerns and what steps the school claimed to take when bullying was reported. She'd even included notes from a phone call with the school counselor, where she'd asked hypothetical questions about how they handled such situations. The final section was perhaps the most painful to read. It contained Daniel's schoolwork from the past few months, showing a clear decline in his grades and the quality of his assignments. But alongside those, Helen had included work Daniel had completed during their tutoring sessions. The difference was striking. When working in a calm environment with patient support, Daniel's work was excellent. The problem wasn't that Daniel couldn't do the work. The problem was that the anxiety and fear had made it impossible for him to function at school. Robert closed the folder and sat back, rubbing his eyes. He felt exhausted and not from the long flight home. This was a different kind of tired, the kind that came from realizing how badly you'd failed at something that mattered. Helen had quietly returned to the kitchen while he was reading. She was making soup just as she'd promised Daniel, the smell of chicken and vegetables filling the air. She worked efficiently, not asking questions, just giving him space to process what he'd read. This must have taken hours, Robert said finally. Helen glanced over from the stove. Daniel needed someone to take him seriously. to believe him. Documentation was the only way I knew to make sure that happened. You went above and beyond what anyone could have expected, Robert said. This isn't part of your job description. Helen turned to face him fully, and there was something fierce in her expression that Robert hadn't seen before. When you see a child hurting, you help them. That doesn't require a job description. Robert nodded slowly. She was right, of course, and her words were an indictment of his own failures, though he didn't think she meant them that way. I need to talk to my wife, Robert said. This can't wait until she gets home from her lunch. Can you stay with Daniel while I make some calls? Of course. Robert took the folder and headed to his study, closing the door behind him. He pulled out his phone and dialed his wife's number. It rang 4 times before she answered. Robert? What's wrong? You're not supposed to be back until next week. The deal closed early, Robert said, his voice tight. I came home. We need to talk. I'm at lunch with the Hendersons. Can this wait until I get home? No, Robert said firmly. It can't. I need you to come home now. There was a pause. What's happened? Is someone hurt? Daniel is home from school. Did you know he's been getting sick every morning? That he's been begging not to go? Another pause, longer this time. He's been a bit dramatic lately. I told you about this. He's going through a phase. This isn't a phase, Catherine, Robert said, his voice harder now. Our son is being bullied at school. He's being physically hurt. And apparently he tried to tell you and you dismissed it. That's not fair. Catherine's voice took on a defensive edge. I've been trying to teach him resilience. You can't coddle children every time things get difficult. The real world is tough and he needs to learn how to handle it. He's 8 years old, Robert said, his voice rising despite his attempt to stay calm. He's 8 years old and other kids are pushing him into lockers and stealing his lunch and calling him names because of his stutter. That's not character building. That's abuse. Don't be dramatic. Boys' roughhouse. It's normal. If we run to the school every time someone hurts his feelings, he'll never learn to stand up for himself. Robert felt his grip tighten on the phone. Come home, Catherine. We're going to discuss this properly, and I suggest you cancel whatever plans you have for the rest of the day because this is going to take time. Robert, I really think you're overreacting. I'm not, Robert interrupted. I'm finally reacting appropriately. Come home. Now. He ended the call before she could respond, his hand shaking slightly. In all their years of marriage, he couldn't remember ever speaking to Catherine like that. Their relationship had always been cordial, businesslike almost. They'd built a life together that looked perfect from the outside. Big house, successful careers, the right social connections. But somewhere along the way, they'd stopped being partners and started being two people who happened to live in the same house. Robert spent the next hour making other calls. He called his assistant and told her to cancel all his meetings for the next 2 weeks. She sounded shocked but agreed immediately. He called his business partner and explained that he needed to step back temporarily to handle a family situation. He called Daniel's school and left a message for the principal, saying that Daniel would not be returning to school until further notice and that he'd be scheduling a meeting to discuss serious concerns. Each call felt like cutting a rope that had been holding him in place. For years, his identity had been tied up in his work, in building and growing his company. But sitting in his study with that folder of documentation in front of him, Robert realized that he'd been so focused on building an empire that he'd neglected his own kingdom. What good was all the money and success if his own son was suffering and he hadn't even noticed? When Catherine finally arrived home an hour later, Robert heard her heels clicking sharply across the marble foyer. She appeared in his study doorway, her expression a mixture of annoyance and concern. She was impeccably dressed, as always, not a hair out of place. This better be important, Robert. I had to leave a very important lunch. Robert stood up and handed her the folder without saying a word. Catherine took it, confused, and began flipping through it. He watched her face as she read, seeing the expressions shift from dismissive to uncomfortable to defensive. Where did this come from? She asked finally. Helen put it together. She's been documenting what's been happening to Daniel because apparently no one else was taking it seriously. The housekeeper? Catherine's voice was incredulous. You're taking the word of the help over mine. Don't, Robert said sharply. Don't make this about her. This is about our son. Look at those pictures, Catherine. Really look at them. Those are bruises on Daniel's body. That's our 8-year-old child being hurt, and you knew something was wrong and you did nothing. I was trying to teach him to be strong, Catherine said, her voice rising. Do you know how embarrassing it is when other mothers talk about their children's achievements, and all I have to report is that mine is too sensitive to handle a normal school environment? The Henderson's son is student council president. The Wong's daughter won the science fair, and our son can't even get through a day at school without crying about his feelings. Robert stared at his wife, seeing her clearly for perhaps the first time in years. Is that what this is about? You're more concerned about how it looks to your friends than about whether our son is actually okay? That's not fair, Catherine said. I want him to succeed. I want him to be strong and confident. But he won't get there if we keep treating him like he's made of glass. There's a difference between encouraging independence and ignoring abuse, Robert said. Daniel tried to tell you what was happening. He came to you for help and you told him he was being weak. Do you know what that does to a child? To feel like even your own mother doesn't believe you or care about your pain. Catherine's face flushed. I do care. I've been trying to do what's best for him. By whose definition? Robert challenged. What's best for him, or what looks best to the other families at the country club? How dare you? Catherine said, her voice cold. I've been here, Robert. I've been the one managing this household, dealing with the school, handling everything while you've been flying around the world closing deals. You have no idea what it's like to be the one holding everything together. You're right, Robert said. I don't because I haven't been here. I've been absent and I take responsibility for that. But you've been here, Catherine, and somehow that's made things worse instead of better. Our son has been suffering and instead of protecting him, you've been more worried about appearances. Catherine's jaw clenched. So what do you want to do? Pull him out of one of the best schools in the state because some kids were mean to him? Teach him that running away is the answer whenever things get hard? I want to put our son's well-being first, Robert said. And yes, that might mean pulling him from that school. It definitely means getting him help. Maybe therapy. It means actually listening to him when he tells us something is wrong instead of dismissing his feelings. And it means what exactly? You're suddenly going to be Father of the Year? You're going to stop traveling for work and be here all the time? Because I'll believe that when I see it. The words stung because there was truth in them. Robert had made promises before about being around more, about making family a priority, and work had always pulled him away. But this felt different. Seeing Daniel's face reading through that documentation, understanding the depth of his son's pain, something had shifted in Robert. He couldn't go back to the way things were. I'm taking 2 weeks off, Robert said. Completely off. No calls, no meetings, nothing. And after that, I'm restructuring things so I can be here more. I'm bringing in additional leadership at the company. I can't keep running everything myself. Catherine laughed, but there was no humor in it. You're going to step back from the company? Robert, the company is your life. It's all you think about, all you talk about. You're going to go crazy within 3 days. Maybe, Robert admitted, but I have to try. Because the alternative is watching my son suffer, while I convince myself that making more money is somehow helping him, and I can't do that anymore. They stood there in silence for a long moment, the distance between them feeling like a canyon. Robert looked at his wife and realized with a sad certainty that they'd been growing apart for years. This crisis with Daniel wasn't creating problems in their marriage. It was just revealing problems that had always been there, hidden beneath the surface of their carefully maintained life. Where is Daniel now? Catherine asked finally, her voice quieter. In the kitchen with Helen, she's making him lunch. Of course she is, Catherine said bitterly. Seems like she's taken over quite a lot around here. She's been there for our son when we weren't, Robert said. I'm grateful to her. You should be too. Catherine set the folder down on Robert's desk. I need to think about all this. I'm going upstairs. She left without another word, and Robert heard her heels clicking up the stairs. He sat back down at his desk feeling drained. The confrontation hadn't gone the way he'd hoped, but he wasn't sure what he'd expected. Years of distance and different priorities couldn't be fixed in one conversation. His phone buzzed with a text message. It was from his business partner. Take all the time you need. Family comes first. We've got this covered. Robert felt a wave of gratitude. At least someone understood. He texted back a quick thank you, then sat for a moment gathering himself. He needed to go check on Daniel, to make sure his son knew that things were going to be different now. That he was going to be different. When Robert walked into the kitchen, he found Daniel sitting at the counter eating soup while Helen washed dishes nearby. Daniel looked up when his father entered, his eyes questioning and a little fearful. Is Mom mad? Daniel asked quietly. Robert came over and sat beside his son. Your mom and I are working through some things. But that's not for you to worry about. What matters is that you're safe and that we're going to make sure you stay safe. Okay? Daniel nodded, though he didn't look entirely convinced. Am I in trouble? No, Robert said firmly. You're not in trouble. None of this is your fault. Not one bit of it. Daniel took another spoonful of soup, and Robert noticed that his hands weren't shaking anymore. That had to count for something. Small steps, Robert told himself. They'd figure this out one step at a time. The next few days were some of the hardest Robert had ever experienced, and he'd built a billion-dollar company from scratch. But somehow navigating the collapse of his family life felt infinitely more difficult than any business challenge he'd ever faced. Catherine moved into the guest room that first night. She didn't announce it or make a big deal about it. She simply took some of her things and closed the door. The message was clear. The distance between them, which had been growing for years, was now physical and undeniable. Robert spent most of his time with Daniel. They had breakfast together each morning, something Robert realized he hadn't done in months, maybe years. They worked on puzzles, watched movies, took walks around the property. At first, Daniel seemed cautious around him, as if waiting for Robert to suddenly announce he had to leave for a business trip or take an important call. But as the days passed and Robert stayed present, really present, Daniel began to relax. Helen was there too, a steady presence that Daniel clearly relied on. Robert watched the easy affection between them and felt a complicated mixture of gratitude and something that might have been jealousy. This woman had earned his son's trust in a few months while Robert had somehow lost it over years. But he pushed those feelings aside. What mattered now was Daniel's well-being, not Robert's ego. On the third day, Robert had scheduled a meeting with Daniel's school. He'd spoken with the principal on the phone, keeping his tone professional but firm. They needed to discuss what had happened to his son and why no one at the school had noticed or intervened. The principal had agreed immediately, probably sensing that Robert wasn't someone who would simply go away quietly. That morning, as Robert was getting ready for the meeting, Daniel appeared in his bedroom doorway. He looked anxious, his hands fidgeting with the hem of his shirt. Are you going to the school? Daniel asked quietly. Yes, Robert said, kneeling down to Daniel's level. I'm going to talk to the principal and your teachers about what happened. About Kevin and the other kids. Daniel's face went pale. Are they going to know I told? They need to know what happened so they can fix it, Robert said gently. But I promise you, I'm not going to let anyone make you feel bad about speaking up. You did the right thing by telling me the truth. Kevin's going to be so mad, Daniel whispered. His dad is really important. He's on the school board. Robert felt anger flare up again at the mention of Kevin and his influential father. Part of the problem, he suspected, was that this boy had never faced real consequences because of his family's position at the school. Let me worry about Kevin and his father, Robert said. Your job is to just be a kid. My job is to protect you, okay? Daniel nodded, but Robert could see he wasn't convinced. Years of being dismissed and hurt had taught his son not to expect much from adults, even from his own parents. That was going to take time to rebuild. Helen appeared behind Daniel, her hand resting gently on his shoulder. Your dad's going to handle this, she said softly. And while he's gone, you and I are going to work on that science project. Remember? We're building the volcano. Daniel's face brightened slightly. The one that erupts? The one that erupts, Helen confirmed with a smile. We'll make it spectacular. Robert felt that complicated feeling again, watching them. But mostly he just felt grateful that Daniel had someone like Helen in his life. The drive to the school took 20 minutes. It was a beautiful campus, all old brick buildings and manicured lawns. The kind of place that looked like it belonged in a movie about elite education. Robert had been so proud when Daniel got accepted here. Now the sight of it just made him feel sick. The principal's office was exactly what Robert expected. Dark wood, leather chairs, walls lined with photos of successful alumni. Principal Jameson was in his 50s, silver-haired and professionally polished. He stood when Robert entered and extended his hand. Mr. Chen, thank you for coming in. I want you to know that we take your concerns very seriously. Robert shook his hand but didn't sit down immediately. He placed Helen's folder on the principal's desk, letting it land with a heavy thud. Do you know what's in this folder? Robert asked. Principal Jameson looked at it uncertainly. I'm not sure. It's documentation of 2 months of systematic bullying that my 8-year-old son has endured at your school. Photos of bruises, written accounts of incidents, a clear timeline showing escalating violence, and according to your own counselor, no reports of any of this exist in your system, which means either no one at this school noticed or no one cared enough to do anything about it. The principal's face tightened. He sat down and opened the folder, beginning to flip through it. Robert watched as his expression shifted from professional concern to genuine alarm. Mr. Chen, I had no idea this was happening. If we'd received reports, my son tried to tell his teacher, Robert interrupted. Once. The teacher separated the children for 1 day and did nothing else. That was the message my son received. That telling adults wouldn't help. That he was on his own. Principal Jameson looked genuinely troubled now. Can you tell me which teacher? Robert named her. The principal made a note. I want to assure you that this is not how we handle bullying at this institution. We have clear policies. I've read your policies, Robert said, his voice hard. They're very impressive on paper. But my son has been living the reality, and the reality doesn't match what you promise parents when they write tuition checks. The principal set down his pen. You're absolutely right. This should never have happened. I want to investigate this immediately. Bring in the students involved. Speak with the teachers. The main student involved is Kevin Peterson, Robert said. Watching the principal's reaction carefully, there it was. A slight pause. A flicker of something in the principal's eyes. Concern, maybe. Or calculation, I see. Principal Jameson said carefully. His father is on your board, isn't he? Mr. Peterson is one of our board members, yes. But that doesn't mean, doesn't it? Robert asked. Because from where I'm standing, it looks like this child has been allowed to terrorize other students without consequences. I have to wonder if that's because of who his father is. The principal's jaw tightened. Mr. Chen, I understand you're upset, but I can assure you that we don't play favorites based on family connections. Then prove it, Robert said. My son isn't coming back to this school. Even if you expelled every child who hurt him, the damage is done. Daniel associates this place with fear and pain, but other children are still here. How many other kids is Kevin bullying? How many other parents are going to get folders like this one? Principal Jameson looked down at the documentation again, and Robert could see him doing mental calculations. The liability issues, the potential lawsuit, the bad publicity if this got out. What do you want? The principal asked finally. I want you to actually investigate this, not a slap on the wrist, not a quiet conversation that goes nowhere. Real consequences. I want the teachers who ignored what was happening to be held accountable. And I want you to look at your systems and figure out why they failed so spectacularly that an 8-year-old fell through the cracks while being physically assaulted on school grounds. We will absolutely investigate, the principal said. And I'd like to meet with you and Daniel to discuss. No, Robert said firmly. Daniel won't be coming back here. He won't be sitting in any meetings with you or anyone else from this school. He's been through enough. This meeting is about making sure this doesn't happen to other children. The principal nodded slowly. I understand. And again, I'm deeply sorry this happened. We'll be conducting a full review. Robert knew that tone. It was the same tone people used in business when they wanted to say the right things, but weren't necessarily committed to real change. But he'd said what he came to say.